Leviathan, the metaphysical anatomy of the lower cycle. Welcome back to Ancient the Architect TV. In this discourse, we are going to identify with exact metaphysical precision what Leviathan is. Leviathan is the vast cyclic order of lower manifested existence. It is the total field of life in time and space as experienced below the higher spiritual reality. It is not merely a creature. It is not merely an image of terror. It is not merely a poetic emblem of danger. Leviathan is the lower cycle itself, the great process through which consciousness enters limitation, becomes involved in conditioned existence, moves through desire, suffering, instability, and lower mentality, and remains enclosed within that order until a higher principle rises within it and brings the cycle toward transmutation. That is the first and most necessary correction. Leviathan is not to be understood as an isolated object within the universe. It is a mode of existence. It is the soul's immersion in the lower order of manifestation. It is life under the conditions of sequence, reaction, development, and incompletion. It is the field in which the eternal appears under temporal conditions, where the unbounded is experienced as process, where pure being is refracted into stages, struggle, appetite, conflict, and gradual formation. Leviathan therefore belongs to the order of manifestation in its lower arc. It signifies the soul's passage through the realm in which life is no longer known in its indivisible fullness, but in divided experience. In Leviathan, being is encountered under the form of cycle. Reality is encountered under the form of process. Consciousness is encountered under the form of bondage, development, and eventual release. Leviathan is the lower life as a totality. This is why the symbol is immense. It is cast as vast, oceanic, coiling, engulfing, and overpowering because it refers to the totality of the lower process, not to one fragment within it. It signifies the full sweep of manifested lower existence in which the soul is enclosed. The lower emotional field, the lower mental field, the instinctive field, the desirous field, the astral field, the field of suffering, the field of repetition, the field of bondage to appearance and to sequence. All of these are gathered into one immense symbolic body. That body is Leviathan. Leviathan is therefore the whole lower process through which the soul passes. It is the field of descent. It is the field of involvement. It is the field of soul probation. It is the field in which spirit is present, but not yet fully sovereign in manifestation. It is the field in which consciousness is subjected to the lower order, so that the latent powers of the higher nature may eventually be brought forth through trial, purification, and transmutation. This is why Leviathan cannot be reduced to mere evil. Evil operates within the lower cycle, but Leviathan is broader than moral evil. It is the total lower field in which ignorance, desire, disorder, passion, illusion, conflict, and bondage become possible, because life is being lived below the plane of integral spiritual government. Leviathan is not merely wickedness. It is the condition in which wickedness, confusion, instability, and suffering arise because the soul is operating within the lower order of manifested life. Leviathan is the great lower circumference of consciousness. It is the soul's circular involvement in becoming. It is the process by which the soul, entering time and space, becomes immersed in the lower sea of existence. That immersion is essential to the symbol. Leviathan is oceanic because the lower life is immersive. The soul does not merely observe the lower order from a distance. It enters it. It is surrounded by it. It is born by it. It is tested within it. It is enclosed within conditions greater than the present ego can command. The lower field is therefore symbolized as deep, as sea, as immense water, as engulfing life, because these images signify a mode of being in which consciousness has entered a moving and unstable medium and must pass through its full process before release is possible. Leviathan is the lower sea of existence, insofar as that sea becomes a cycle. It is the immense movement of conditioned life. It is the lower current of manifestation. It is the total order in which undeveloped consciousness is carried through stages of experience. This is why Leviathan is associated with forms that coil, surround, swallow, carry, or bind. Those forms reveal metaphysical enclosure. They reveal that the soul is not yet standing in its pure freedom, but is moving through a bounded order. It is inside process. It is inside necessity. It is inside development. It is inside the law of the lower world. Leviathan is therefore the soul's enclosure within the lower cycle. To say that Leviathan devours is to say that the unawakened soul is absorbed in the lower process. To say that Leviathan surrounds is to say that lower life is the medium of experience. To say that Leviathan is broken is to say that the totality of lower life is eventually mastered, divided, understood, and assimilated. To say that Leviathan is overcome is to say that consciousness is no longer ruled by the lower cycle from within. Now we have to be even more exact. Leviathan includes the lower desires, but it is not exhausted by desire. Desire is one of its internal powers. Leviathan is larger. It is the full lower order in which desire operates. The cravings, appetites, passions, reactive impulses, attractions, repulsions, sensual compulsions, and emotional disturbances of the lower being all belong to Leviathan because Leviathan is the field in which these things live and move. Yet Leviathan is not merely a collection of passions. It is the total processive order in which passions are generated, repeated, intensified, frustrated, and, in due time, transmuted. Leviathan also includes the lower mind. This must be stated with full seriousness. The lower mind is not free merely because it thinks. The lower mind, before transmutation, belongs to the same lower cycle. It is fragmentary, reactive, imitative, attached to forms, bound to surfaces, dependent upon externalities, and unable to govern the lower life because it itself is still conditioned by the lower field. It does not yet stand in the light of direct higher intelligence. It works by repetition, convention, reaction, argument, and outward fixation. This too is Leviathan. Leviathan is therefore not only the soul's involvement in passion, it is the soul's involvement in lower mentality as well. It is the total lower order before the emergence of the illumined governing principle. That governing principle is decisive. Leviathan exists wherever the lower field is operative without full higher government. Where the higher principle is latent, Leviathan dominates. Where desire outruns truth, Leviathan dominates. Where emotion is unpurified, Leviathan dominates. Where mind is outward bound and divided, Leviathan dominates. Where consciousness lives by reaction rather than inward law, Leviathan dominates. Where the soul remains enclosed in repetition, instability, and incompletion, Leviathan dominates. This is why Leviathan belongs to bondage. Not merely bondage as outer oppression, but bondage as metaphysical captivity to the lower cycle. The soul under Leviathan is bound to lower sequence, lower appetite, lower mentality, lower law, and lower illusion. It has not yet risen into its own spiritual sovereignty. It lives in the field where things are experienced as struggle, hunger, frustration, instability, and incomplete perception. But Leviathan is not meaningless bondage. Leviathan is lawful bondage. That is the crucial point. The lower cycle is not ultimate reality, but it has a function within manifestation. The soul enters the lower field so that latent powers may become actual through experience. The soul enters process so that what is undeveloped may become formed. The soul enters limitation so that discernment, strength, understanding, and purification may arise under conditions where they can be tested. Leviathan is therefore not outside the metaphysical order. It is the lower process within that order. It is the cycle in which undeveloped consciousness becomes educable. It is the arena in which the soul, though bound, is being worked upon. It is the field in which the higher can eventually appear through the exhaustion of the lower. This is why Leviathan must never be treated as though it were only negative. It is terrible because it is the realm of immersion, suffering, and bondage. But it is also necessary because it is the realm in which experience becomes substance. The lower cycle yields content. It yields developed intelligence. It yields tested consciousness. It yields the fruit of struggle. It yields the material through which later transmutation becomes possible. This is one of the deepest points in the whole symbolism. The cycle is not only endured, it is mined. The lower process is not only survived, it is worked through. The experiences generated in the lower order do not disappear into nothing. They become material for higher assimilation. Thus Leviathan, once mastered, becomes nourishment. What once bound the soul is broken open and made useful to the soul. What once enclosed consciousness is reduced to assimilable substance. What once appeared as overwhelming totality becomes distributable content for higher development. This means Leviathan is conquered not simply by negation, but by transformation. The soul passes through the lower cycle so completely that the products of the cycle become food for wisdom. Experience is no longer raw burden. It becomes intelligible substance. The soul digests what once seemed monstrous. It incorporates what once ruled it. The lower is not merely rejected. It is transmuted and subordinated. This is why the breaking of Leviathan is such a profound image. It signifies the end of the lower totality as an undivided power over consciousness. The great enclosing cycle is no longer experienced as one engulfing whole. It is broken into knowable parts. Its contents become available to higher assimilation. The soul is no longer swallowed by the cycle. The soul begins to understand the cycle, master the cycle, and draw sustenance from the cycle. But this requires another element, purification. Leviathan cannot be overcome while the emotional nature remains unpurified. The lower emotional life is one of the great media through which the lower cycle holds consciousness. So long as emotion remains bound to desire, the soul remains tied to sorrow, attachment, instability, and lower reaction. But when emotion is purified, it no longer serves the lower appetitive order. It becomes strength. It becomes a bridge upward. It ceases to drag consciousness downward and instead begins to cooperate with the emergence of the higher life. This is why the conquest of Leviathan is inseparable from the purification of the effective life. The lower cycle is not overcome only by thought. It is overcome when the whole intermediate field between higher intelligence and lower appetite is transformed. Then what once produced sorrow becomes capable of bearing joy. What once transmitted bondage becomes capable of transmitting strength. This transmutation also requires the awakening of true intelligence. Leviathan rules where there is no true head. The head, metaphysically understood, is not mere mentality. It is illumined understanding. It is governing intelligence. It is the principle within consciousness by which experience is rightly interpreted, and the lower nature is subordinated to higher law. When this governing principle is absent or weak, the lower field remains dominant. Desire, habit, appearance, and repetition rule. The soul is carried by the lower current. But when the governing intelligence awakens, Leviathan begins to lose its absolute hold. Then the cycle is no longer merely suffered. It is read. It is no longer merely endured. It is interpreted. It is no longer merely binding. It becomes material for wisdom. The awakened intelligence does not annihilate the cycle instantly, but it changes the soul's relation to it. The lower process becomes visible as process. This is decisive. For the first great victory over Leviathan is not yet total liberation, but correct inward sight. When consciousness sees the lower cycle for what it is, it ceases to absolutize it. It ceases to identify bondage with truth. It ceases to confuse repetition with life itself. It begins to understand that the lower order is a stage, not the final reality of being. Leviathan is thus defeated progressively by illumination, not by panic, not by outer sensationalism, not by projection, but by the birth of higher understanding, purified emotion, and disciplined inward sovereignty. Now we can speak of suffering. Leviathan is deeply bound up with suffering, because suffering is the friction of consciousness within the lower cycle. Where the soul is enclosed in time, appetite, reaction, limitation, obscurity, and incompletion, suffering is inevitable. This suffering is not merely accidental pain. It is the metaphysical strain of spirit involved in a lower order that cannot fully express its own depth. It is the result of incompletion, of divided existence, of consciousness subjected to lower law. Yet suffering is not Leviathan's end. Leviathan is the process within which suffering is generated until the lower nature is overcome. Once the lower order is subordinated and the higher life becomes active, suffering loses its old dominion. The soul begins to stand above what once engulfed it. The lower cycle may still be present as field, but it is no longer present as master. This is why Leviathan is not final. It is immense, but not final. It is lawful, but not ultimate. It is overwhelming, but not absolute. It belongs to the order of time and space. It belongs to conditioned manifestation. It belongs to the soul's passage through lower existence. But it does not belong to the final truth of being. Leviathan is the lower cycle, not the highest reality. It is the process through which the soul passes, not the eternal identity of the soul. It is the field of immersion, not the source of being. It is the law of the lower order, not the fullness beyond all division. This is why the symbolism surrounding Leviathan so often turns toward emergence. Something rises from the lower field. Something higher is born out of the perfected lower process. The soul does not remain forever submerged. The lower cycle carries within itself the possibility of higher birth. When the lower process has done its work, the higher mind emerges. The deeper consciousness rises. Wisdom is born from beneath the level of appetite and reaction. The soul begins to ascend from the very field that once enclosed it. This is not an incidental detail. It is the very key to the whole matter. Leviathan is not merely the enemy of ascent. Leviathan is the lower cycle through which ascent becomes necessary and possible. The soul emerges from it because the soul has been worked upon within it. The higher appears because the lower has been transmuted. Wisdom is born because experience has been assimilated. The great cycle is not denied. It is completed. Thus, Leviathan, in the highest precision, is the great cyclic process of lower manifested life through which the soul descends into conditioned existence and becomes involved in matter, desire, lower mind, suffering, bondage, and repetition. Until through purification, developed intelligence, and the awakening of the higher principle, the lower order is mastered, its fruits are assimilated, and consciousness rises beyond the illusion that once enclosed it. That is Leviathan. Leviathan is the lower life as process. Leviathan is the lower nature as total cycle. Leviathan is the soul's immersion in the ocean of conditioned existence. Leviathan is the enclosing order of time-space manifestation below the higher planes. Leviathan is the whole lower field in which passion, suffering, bondage, and lower mentality operate before transmutation. Leviathan is the lawful but non-ultimate cycle through which consciousness must pass until the higher life becomes active enough to govern, transform, and transcend the lower. And therefore, Leviathan is not rightly understood as a mere beast. It is the great lower cycle itself. It is the immense order of manifested bondage. It is the vast process of lower becoming. It is the soul's passage through the waters of limitation. It is the long curve of descent, struggle, and eventual release. And the overcoming of Leviathan is the establishment of the higher life within consciousness so fully that the lower cycle ceases to rule as master and becomes instead the conquered field from which wisdom has been drawn. Now that the metaphysical identity of Leviathan has been established with precision, let us move from definition to scriptural application and examine the biblical passages in which Leviathan is explicitly named to determine what those verses are actually revealing once the symbol is understood correctly. When read in light of its true metaphysical meaning, the scriptural language ceases to describe a mere monstrous creature and instead discloses the structure, power, and eventual overthrow of the lower cyclic order through which the soul passes. The conclusion we can draw is that the biblical references to Leviathan are not primarily identifying a zoological monster, but revealing a metaphysical principle, the lower cyclic order of manifested life that binds the soul until it is mastered, broken, and transmuted. If Leviathan is understood metaphysically, then the verses stop reading like mythology and start reading like spiritual anatomy. In Job 41, Leviathan is presented as a power beyond the control of the ordinary man. Metaphysically, that means the lower cycle of existence cannot be conquered by the untransformed personality. The natural man cannot simply dominate the lower nature by ego, force, or surface religion. The lower cycle is too vast, too ancient, too structurally embedded in manifested life. It can only be overcome by a higher principle than the ordinary self. So the conclusion from Job is that Leviathan represents a lawful and overwhelming order of lower existence that exceeds the power of the unredeemed man to master. In Job 41:22, where it says, "In his neck remaineth strength, and sorrow is turned into joy before him," the conclusion is not that a beast has a strong neck in a merely physical sense. The point is that once the intermediate nature is purified and strengthened, the soul gains power over the lower cycle, and suffering is no longer final. So here Leviathan reveals that the cycle of lower life produces sorrow only until it is spiritually mastered. Then what was sorrow becomes the occasion of transformation. In Psalm 74:14, "Thou breakest the heads of Leviathan in pieces, and gavest him to be meat to the people inhabiting the wilderness," the conclusion becomes very sharp. If Leviathan is the total lower cycle, then the breaking of the heads signifies the fragmentation of the lower totality into intelligible and assimilable parts. In other words, what once ruled consciousness as a single engulfing power is broken open. Its contents become nourishment. The soul in the wilderness, meaning in the field of lower life and spiritual testing, is sustained by the very experience extracted from the conquered cycle. So the conclusion here is that the lower cycle is not merely destroyed, it is broken, understood, and transmuted into substance for further development. In Isaiah 27:1, where the Lord punishes Leviathan the piercing serpent and that crooked serpent, and slays the dragon that is in the sea, the conclusion is that the divine order eventually brings the lower cyclic process to judgment and termination as a ruling power. The serpent imagery points to continuity, coiling recurrence, and the binding motion of lower existence. The sea indicates the lower field of immersion and instability. So this verse reveals that the lower cycle is not eternal in authority. It is destined to be ended as the dominant order over consciousness. So when all of the explicitly named biblical references are read together metaphysically, the conclusion is this: Leviathan is the great lower process of manifested existence in which the soul is bound to time, desire, suffering, lower mentality, and cyclic repetition. Scripture names it explicitly to show that this lower order is real, immense, difficult for the ordinary man to master, but ultimately breakable, transmutable, and subject to divine conquest. That is the core conclusion. More precisely, the verses collectively teach 5 things. First, Leviathan is larger than personal weakness. It is not just one bad habit or one temptation. It is the whole lower cycle. Second, Leviathan cannot be mastered by the ordinary ego. The natural man is inside the cycle, and therefore cannot sovereignly rule it from his present condition. Third, Leviathan is the source field of sorrow, bondage, and struggle, because it is the order of life below the higher spiritual government. Fourth, Leviathan must be broken, not merely feared. Its contents must be divided, understood, and assimilated. Fifth, Leviathan is not ultimate. It is a temporary though immense order within manifestation, and it is subject to divine overthrow. So the final conclusion is, the Bible's explicit naming of Leviathan is not there to direct attention to a literal sea monster, but to unveil the existence of a vast lower cycle of life through which the soul passes and from which it must ultimately be liberated.